Melinda, let me turn to you next. So, two questions. One, do you concur with Rahul's assessment? The second is, does a whitelist, blacklist, whatever it is, does it actually solve law enforcement concerns about getting quicker access to data, easier access to data? How is that going to play out if we go with this kind of an approach?
So I agree with what you were saying. I mean, I leave it to you about the assessment of where India is in the progression of data protection law. But I think, I think generally the approach set out in the law is the whitelist, blacklist, is an opportunity for India to determine what it wants that to be. It has lessons to be learned from the EU. It has lessons to be learned from other places. It need not be, a kind of adequacy regime. Indeed, I think, trying to impose that level of review at this stage would be quite cumbersome. I mean, Ralph knows better than anyone how long the adequacy reviews process take. And so I think there are a lot of open questions about what should be reviewed as part of that assessment. You want to make sure you're making kind of apples to apples comparisons, and that may be hard if for some countries in the world. And so, I think it's an interesting idea to think about a blacklist approach. Default is that data can flow unless certain criteria are present, in which case it cannot. So I think it's, there's a lot of room here to explore really creative solutions. I also think it's important, if we just step back for 1 second into kind of first principles here, what we're trying to do is protect the data where it flows, and everyone agrees on that. If that's the case, we also need to give tools back to companies to be able to do that themselves, apart from the government's whitelisting or blacklisting. And so in prior versions of the draft, there were other bases for transfer, like intergroup schemes or contractual clauses, which do exist in the EU and which have now been taken out of the draft. And so I think if the goal here is to protect data, then we need to employ all of the tools to do that, particularly because administering the kind of whitelist blacklist regime is going to be a big task. So that said, I think on your question about law enforcement access, I mean, I think, again, it depends on what considerations are going to be taken into account as part of the whitelist exercise. Is India going to look at law enforcement access data issues? And so I think that's an open question. I don't think this inherently, I know that concerns about law enforcement access to data were a prime driver of data localization, although, I think has been explored a lot in the last few years. Localization does not solve that problem at all because of the legal regimes that us as a US company have to comply with. It doesn't actually break that deadlock. And so that's why I think the work that Audrey was referencing at the OECD in terms of, coming to a common set of principles around trusted government access to data is incredibly important. And I think the more that we kind of converge in that space as a set of like-minded countries, it is going to chip away at some of those underlying tensions that are driving some of the data localization debate.
Thank you. And Rahul, let me come to you on the same theme, because I think it's something that is an important motivation for why we've been talking about localization. And you made that point in your opening remarks also, that even if you do have this version of the bill, we still have to worry about increasing regulatory requirements in other sectors, RBI, SEBI, IRDA, and so on, who are already insisting on some level of localization, and it may continue creeping. Right, so how do we solve that problem? Does whitelisting guarantee some kind of a panacea, or are there other mechanisms that we need to think about?
No, look, I mean, I think the sectoral regulators are going to have to take their own call as to what they're going to do with that. But I think I'm just hopeful that since the first draft of the data protection law gave the direction to sort of try this data localization, and having had such fulsome discussions, as Melinda says, went through this whole question of whether it improves access or not, And it seems like the government is walking that back. Perhaps that would encourage the RBI to walk it back. I have absolutely no hope that it will, but that's the only thing that we can expect. I don't think it's a panacea. I think what this law says will be with regard to the data that falls within its ambit to regulate. But if the Reserve Bank of India has a higher bar for financial information, then I think that bar, it's the prerogative of the Reserve Bank of India to do what it wants with that data. And I don't see this in any way rescinding the payment localization mandate or perhaps even the e-commerce and the other mandates that are coming out.
Right. Audrey and then Ralph, similar question, but what do you think are some of the other mechanisms that you see used bilaterally, multilaterally, or within the domestic jurisdiction itself that tries to give the level of access to law enforcement authorities to domestic citizen data? What is a good way to ensure this access? Audrey?
So yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think there, on the maybe separating law enforcement and national security, which we do not do in our work at the OECD, we have them together for various reasons. We have them together, but I think in the law enforcement sphere, there is much more activity and common or efforts and international cooperation in law enforcement at the European level, but also across borders. On the national security side, I think there's much less, at least in terms of international instruments, or maybe nothing. And so in that sense, I think our principles are unique. Also the scope in which of the countries that they recognize. So it's obviously much of Europe, which is members of the OECD, but also Asia and South America and North America. So we've managed to compare a bit the systems for accessing data under law enforcement and national security laws in a sort of geographically diverse set of democracies, which is unique. And I think the first time you will see something common written about how what the protections are in these cases, which is what we're most interested in. We know that access needs to be sought. Ralph said it. All of our democracies have provisions, including the draft bill in India, for accessing data for the purposes of protecting the state, for the purposes of countering terrorism, for the purposes of enforcing the law. Those all exist, and they are usually carve-outs for general data protection law. They're usually exceptions to certain protections. It's the balancing, or the decisions of balancing rights. And so we know that rights often can need to be balanced, and that in order to infringe on a right, there has to be a justification and various things. So, for example, when the right to privacy is in conflict with the right to security or the right to, but anyway, the principles on government access intend to sort of set this baseline for the discussion about how our democracies increasingly deal with that set of trade-offs that have to be made when accessing data. I think, it was sort of not overtly referred to, but the Cloud Act approach, where a jurisdiction can get access, is another consideration. I think that Melissa mentioned it in her intervention. So, these are various moving pieces to try to kind of get at this issue of how these type of authorities access data and how to build trust in that, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to allow data to flow and trying to look for reasons to trust another place, another jurisdiction, another country's system. And in order to trust, you have to understand. And in order to understand, you have to have some amount of communication and transparency. And so, ultimately, this is the first step, at least in that domain, from our side in the OECD.
Rahul, a great note to end the discussion on, very constructive. And I must thank all the panelists for a really engaging discussion. Thank you.